The year is 1876, and winter came to the Colorado Territory like a thief. In Silver Hollow, a mining town tucked into the sharp folds of the San Juan Mountains. It stole the last warmth from the ground before October was out. The main street was a rutted track of frozen mud, hard as iron. The only sounds were the rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer, a lonely church bell tolling the hour, and the wind whistling through the skeletal frames of half-finished buildings. A permanent haze of coal smoke hung in the air, tasting of grit and failed ambition. Sarah McKenna pulled her thin morning shawl tighter, the black wool worn nearly gray. At 28, she was a widow, a title that sat on her shoulders with the weight of the mountain itself. The last coin she owned felt slick and cold in her palm. It was enough for a small sack of flour. Maybe it would have to be. Inside the general store, the air was thick with the scent of coffee, salted pork, and the unspoken judgment of her neighbors. Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, avoided her eyes as he weighed the flour. His movements were too precise, his silence too loud. She was a ghost in her own town, a walking reminder of the mine collapse that had taken her husband, Liam, and 5 other men 6 months prior. They called it an accident, a tragedy, but the whispers that followed Sarah down the street called it something else, a curse. She was the bad luck wife, the woman who'd sent her man to his grave. As she stepped back onto the boardwalk, clutching the small sack of flour that felt more like a bag of stones, she saw him. He stood by the trading post, a man who seemed carved from the mountain itself, Jacob Stone. The townspeople called him the Mountain Man, a name that was part respect, part fear. He lived alone up in a place they called Beartooth Basin, emerging only a few times a year with a sled piled high with beaver, fox, and wolf pelts. He was tall and broad, dressed in buckskins that had seen years of hard use. His beard was dark and untrimmed, and his eyes, the color of a winter sky, missed nothing. He was trading his furs for the essentials: salt, bullets, coffee, and iron traps. He didn't speak much, his transactions conducted with grunts and nods. But his presence was a solid, quiet thing in the nervous energy of the town. He watched the people of Silver Hollow, his gaze lingering on the tight, pinched faces. He'd seen this look before, in starving garrisons during the war. It was the look of people whose resources were running low, not just food and supplies, but kindness, too. When a community gets hungry, it starts looking for someone to devour. His eyes met Sarah's for a fleeting second. He saw the flour sack, the worn shawl, and the defiant set of her jaw. He saw a woman braced for a storm, and he gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod before turning back to his business. It wasn't pity. It was acknowledgement, a silent recognition from one solitary soul to another. Sarah hurried away, her heart thumping. That small gesture, that simple nod, was more humanity than she'd been shown in months. It was a dangerous thing to hope for. The engine of Silver Hollow was Royce Calder's mine, and Royce Calder was the engine of the town. He owned the land, the shafts, the company store, and most of the men. His power was absolute, buttressed by the town's other pillars. There was Reverend Pike, whose Sunday sermons increasingly wove tales of divine retribution and the consequences of sin, his eyes often finding Sarah in her lonely pew. Dr. Whitlow, a man with a cold, clinical view of life, spoke of community health and the need to excise any element that proved unhealthy. And then there was Deputy Jonah Cade, a brutal man with a tin star and a loyalty to Calder that was bought and paid for in whiskey and silver. He was Calder's fist. Lately, that fist had felt like it was closing around Sarah. The whispers had grown louder. The mine's output had slowed. The early snows had blocked the supply passes. And a fever had swept through the shanties on the edge of town. It was easier to blame the widow with the sad eyes than to blame a greedy mine boss or a merciless winter. The town council meeting was held that evening in the church, the only building large enough to hold the town's fear. Sarah wasn't invited. But she didn't need to be. She could feel the weight of their deliberations from her small, cold cabin at the end of the street. She sat at her rough-hewn table, the flour sack untouched. In her hands, she held the one thing she had left of Liam, a small, dented tin box. Inside lay his journal. It wasn't a diary of feelings, but a working man's ledger. Pages of neatly penciled numbers, calculations of ore extracted, payroll figures, supply costs. But in the last few months of his life, the entries had become strange. The profit numbers he'd scribbled in the margins didn't align with the official figures Calder posted. Tucked into the back of the book was a hand-drawn map of the mine's lower levels, different from the one displayed in the company office. It showed a strange spur, a hidden tunnel, and near it, a symbol she didn't understand. Next to the words, "water flow wrong," Liam had been trying to tell her something, but he'd died before he could find the words. This box held a secret, she was sure of it. A truth locked away in numbers and lines only a miner could fully comprehend. It felt dangerous, a spark in a powder keg. A sharp knock at the door made her jump. It was Tom Garrett, the old mail carrier, his face etched with sorrow. He held his hat in his hands. "Sarah," he began, his voice raspy. "The council, they've made a decision." She steeled herself. "They're casting me out." "Not in so many words," he said, looking at the floorboards. "They're calling it an honorable relocation, for the good of the community." He swallowed hard. The vote was nearly unanimous. Calder, the Reverend. They spoke of the town's misfortunes since the collapse. They said the town needs a fresh start, a clean slate. The old rumor, the one that had clung to her like grave dust, was now official town policy, * whoever marries her will die in the ground. She was a blight, a source of contagion to be removed. The injustice of it was a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. She had mourned her husband, tended his grave, and tried to survive with quiet dignity, only to be blamed for his death by the very people who had sung his praises at the funeral. "Where am I to go?" she whispered. "The passes are snowed in." This was the part Tom couldn't bring himself to say. He just shook his head, a tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek, and left her standing in the silence. The next morning, the verdict was delivered not as a sentence, but as a twisted act of charity. Royce Calder stood on the steps of the general store, his voice booming across the frozen street. Most of the town was gathered, their faces a mixture of shame and grim relief. Deputy Cade stood beside him, hand resting on his pistol, ensuring the crowd remained orderly. Jacob Stone was loading the last of his supplies onto his dog sled when he heard Calder's speech. He paused, his hands stilling on a rope. "Friends, neighbors," Calder announced, "these are trying times. The Lord has tested us with hardship. Food is scarce, and our spirits are low. We must look after our own, but our resources are finite. We have among us a woman, Mrs. McKenna, a widow with no family and no means, a woman burdened by a terrible sadness." He let the word hang in the cold air, heavy with insinuation. "The town council, in its wisdom and mercy, has decided we cannot simply turn her out into the cold. That would not be a Christian act." Reverend Pike nodded gravely from the crowd. "So we have come up with a humane solution," Calder continued, a magnanimous smile spreading across his face. "A way to provide for her and relieve the town of its burden. Jacob Stone." He pointed a thick finger at the mountain man. Jacob's head came up slowly, his expression unreadable. "You are a man of the wilderness, strong, capable. You live apart from our troubles. We are prepared to offer you a bonus on your trade, a full winter's supply of flour, salt, and ammunition. A gift from the grateful people of Silver Hollow." A murmur went through the crowd. This was more than anyone expected. "In exchange," Calder's voice dropped, becoming a conspiratorial boom, "you will take this woman with you, give her shelter, see to her needs. She can cook, she can mend. Be a helpmate to you. We are giving you the woman no one wanted, but perhaps in the wilderness, she can find a use. The raw, ugly truth of it was laid bare. It wasn't an exile, it was a transaction. They were selling her, trading her for flour and bullets like a sack of grain. Sarah stood frozen on the porch of her cabin, having heard it all. The world tilted, the faces in the crowd blurring into a single, monstrous entity of judgment. Jacob Stone straightened to his full height. He looked from Calder's triumphant face to the shuffling, embarrassed townspeople. Then his gaze traveled down the street and found Sarah. He saw the terror in her eyes, but beneath it, a flicker of iron will that had not yet been extinguished. The town saw a curse, a burden, a thing to be disposed of. Jacob Stone, who had spent a lifetime reading the subtle tracks of animals and the silent language of the forest, saw something else entirely. He saw a survivor. Slowly, deliberately, he began walking toward Royce Calder, his boots crunching on the frozen mud. The crowd parted before him, a hush falling over the entire town of Silver Hollow. The deal had been offered. Now, the mountain man would give his answer. Jacob Stone walked not with a swagger, but with the deliberate, ground-covering pace of a man who knows his own strength and has no need to advertise it. The crowd, which had been a single jeering voice moments before, fragmented into nervous individuals, shuffling back to let him pass. He stopped before Royce Calder, but his eyes were on the pile of supplies being loaded onto the general store's porch flour, salt, coffee, a crate of ammunition, the promised price. Calder puffed out his chest. Well, Stone, a generous offer. Is it not a fine woman to warm your cabin, and a full larder for your trouble? A few men snickered. The word fine was hung with a dozen ugly meanings. Jacob's gaze remained on the supplies. He addressed the storekeeper, Henderson, his voice a low rumble that cut through the cold air. Is that the full winter portion Calder promised? Henderson, sweating despite the chill, stammered, Yes, Mr. Stone, as agreed by the council. Then add 2 more sacks of flour and a bolt of wool cloth, Jacob said, his eyes still not acknowledging Calder. I'll cover it with the last of the fox pelts. He finally turned his head, his winter sky eyes pinning Calder in place. The woman is not part of the trade. The statement was flat, a declaration of fact. Calder's face purpled. Now see here, the arrangement was you offer. I accept, Jacob interrupted, his tone dangerously calm. I'm accepting the supplies. What I do with my charity is my own affair. He had turned Calder's condescending words into a weapon and handed them back to him. The mine boss was left sputtering, his public act of mercy exposed as a crude bargain that the other party had just refused to honor in spirit. Deputy Jonah Cade, seeing his employer's authority challenged, stepped forward. He was a big man, soft in the middle but with a brawler's heavy shoulders. You watch your mouth. Mountain man. You're talking to the man who runs this town. Jacob looked Cade up and down, a flicker of something ancient and weary in his eyes. It was the look of a man who had seen real violence and found this imitation of it pathetic. I'm here to collect my goods. Deputy, he said, his voice dropping even lower. Not looking for trouble, but I've learned it's best to settle accounts before you leave town. The threat was veiled, but every person there understood it. Cade's hand hovered over his pistol, but he didn't draw. There was a certainty about Jacob Stone, a stillness that suggested he was 10 steps ahead of any move Cade might make. The deputy held his ground, but the moment of confrontation passed, leaving a sour taste in the air. While the men postured, Sarah felt the full weight of 100 pairs of eyes. She was a piece of property being haggled over. The women of the town, women she had known for years, looked away. Some clutched their children closer, as if her bad luck were a contagion that could leap across the frozen street. Their silence was worse than the men's crude remarks. It was a complete and total abandonment. Just then, a figure detached from the small, respectable cluster of business owners near the bank. It was Abigail Hart, the banker's wife, a woman known for her piety and impeccable fashion. She walked with purpose, her head held high, as if on an errand of great importance. As she passed Sarah, she seemed to stumble, her gloved hand brushing against Sarah's arm. "Oh, forgive me, Mrs. McKenna," she said, her voice clear and formal for the benefit of any onlookers. But in that brief touch, she pressed a thick, soft object into Sarah's hand. It was a dark blue wool scarf, finely knit and warm. Abigail's eyes, for a single moment, were not the cold, calculating eyes of a banker's wife, but those of another woman who understood the cage of public opinion. "Don't let them define you," Abigail whispered, a breath of steam in the cold air, so quiet only Sarah could hear. Then she was gone, continuing down the boardwalk as if nothing had happened. Sarah clutched the scarf. It was a small anchor in a sea of hostility, a reminder that a spark of decency might still exist in this town, however hidden. Jacob finished loading the extra supplies onto his long, sturdy sled, expertly lashing them down under a canvas tarp. The sled dogs, a team of 6 hardy huskies, whined and shifted, eager to run when everything was secure. He turned his back on Calder and the rest of the town square and walked directly to Sarah's cabin. He stopped a few feet from her porch, leaving a space between them. He took off his fur cap, holding it in his hands in a gesture of respect that stunned the onlookers into silence. "Mrs. McKenna," he said. His voice was not soft, but it was steady. He looked directly at her, and there was no pity in his gaze, only a straightforward appraisal. "You heard the man. They mean to cast you out. The passes will be snowed in until May. Alone, you won't survive a month." He laid the facts out, plain and unadorned. He wasn't trying to scare her. He was giving her the truth. "I have a cabin in the High Valley," he went on. "It's warm. There's food enough for 2. You would be safe there." Sarah's throat was tight. In exchange for what she asked, her voice raspy, "To be your helpmate." A muscle tightened in his jaw. "I have no need of a helpmate. Ma'am, I need a cook about as much as a fish needs a saddle. I've been on my own for a long time. My offer is for shelter. Nothing more is asked. Nothing more is offered." He paused, letting his words settle. The entire town was listening, straining to hear the final negotiation for her life. Then he did something that changed everything. He took a half-step closer and lowered his voice so that only she could hear. "But this has to be your choice. I won't haul anyone up that mountain who doesn't want to be there. If you say no, I'll leave the extra flour on your step and be on my way. You can face this down on your own terms. If you say yes, we leave now. It's your decision, not theirs." He gave her back her name. He gave her back her will. In that moment, he was the only person who saw her not as a curse, a burden, or an object, but as a human being with the right to choose her own fate. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but beneath it, a tiny, hot seed of defiance began to grow. She could stay here and be slowly crushed by their judgment and scorn. Or she could step into the vast, dangerous unknown with a stranger who had shown her more respect in 5 minutes than the town had in 6 months. She looked past him, at the faces of her accusers. She saw Royce Calder, his face contorted in a mask of frustrated power. She saw Reverend Pike, already composing the sermon that would justify this day. And she saw the tired, hopeless faces of the people who had chosen her as their sacrifice. She would not give them the satisfaction of breaking her. With a deep breath that felt like her first in a very long time, Sarah nodded, just once. A collective sigh went through the crowd. The drama was over. The transaction was complete. But Sarah wasn't finished. She did not wait for Jacob to lead her. She did not bow her head in submission. Holding the new wool scarf in one hand, she straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and walked down the steps of her cabin. She walked past Jacob and straight toward the sled, her boots making a determined, rhythmic crunch in the snow. She was not being taken. She was leaving. Just as she reached the sled, a small figure darted out from the crowd. It was Millie, the blacksmith's orphan niece, a slip of a girl with wide, frightened eyes. She clutched a folded, grimy piece of paper in her hand. "Mrs. McKenna," she whispered, pressing the paper into Sarah's free hand. "This was my pa's." Her father had been one of the miners who hadn't vanished in the collapse, but had simply disappeared a month before, supposedly having run off to a new gold strike. "He told me to give it to Mr. McKenna if anything happened to him." The girl rushed on, her words tumbling out in a terrified whisper. "He said your Liam was helping him look about the water." Sarah looked down at the paper. It was a letter, the writing rough. She only caught a few words before Millie scurried back into the crowd. Asterisk. "The water ain't right. Calder's strange dam up the creek. It's stealing the flow. Asterisk." Sarah quickly tucked the letter into the pocket of her dress. Another piece of the puzzle. Another secret the mountain held. Jacob helped her settle into a space cleared among the supplies, ensuring she was shielded from the wind. He gave no sign that he had seen the exchange with the girl. Without another word to the town, he gave a sharp whistle. Hup. The dogs lunged into their harnesses, and the sled runners hissed to life. They moved past the general store, past the silent church, past the faces of Silver Hollow. The sled glided out of town, leaving the suffocating grip of judgment behind. As they rounded the first bend in the trail, the sounds of the town faded, replaced by the panting of the dogs and the whisper of the wind through the pines. The sled was more than a conveyance of wood and iron. It was a boundary line. With every foot it traveled, it carried Sarah further away from the woman they thought she was, and deeper into the vast, silent wilderness where, for the first time in a long time, she had no name but her own. The ascent into Beartooth Basin was a journey into silence. The sled runners slid over the packed snow with a soft shush. The dogs panted in rhythmic puffs of steam, and Jacob's occasional commands, gee-haw, were swallowed by the immense quiet of the pines. For Sarah, the silence was a balm. It scrubbed away the whispers and the jeers, replacing the town's suffocating judgment with the clean, sharp indifference of nature. Here, the mountains didn't care about her past or the curse she supposedly carried. They cared only about wind, and snow, and survival. They traveled for hours, climbing steadily into a world of white and gray. The sky, which had been clear, began to clot with heavy, bruised-looking clouds. Snow began to fall, not in gentle flakes, but in a thick, purposeful curtain that quickly obscured the trail behind them. Jacob pushed the dogs harder, his face set in a grim line. Just as the last of the daylight was being wrung from the sky, they crested a ridge and descended into a small, sheltered valley. Tucked against a wall of granite and protected by a stand of ancient fir trees was a cabin. It was not a shack, but a solid structure of thick, expertly notched logs, with a stone chimney breathing a thin plume of smoke. A small, sturdy barn stood nearby. It looked less like a temporary shelter and more like a place that had grown from the earth, as permanent as the mountains that cradled it. Inside, the cabin was a single room, spare and meticulously organized. Furs were stacked neatly in one corner. Traps and tools hung from wooden pegs, and shelves held tins of coffee, salt, and beans. A large stone hearth dominated one wall, its embers glowing faintly. The space was masculine and Spartan, yet it radiated a sense of profound safety. It was a fortress against the storm that was now beginning to howl outside. "Stove's still warm," Jacob said, his first words in over an hour. "Get your shawl off. I'll see to the dogs and the horse." Left alone, Sarah felt a wave of uncertainty. She was a trespasser in this quiet, ordered world. The chill from the journey had sunk deep into her bones. The hearth, with its promise of warmth, beckoned. She remembered the taunt from town. Asterisk. She can cook, she can mend. A bitter resolve rose in her. She would not be a useless burden. She found the kindling box and a stack of split pine. She'd lit the stove in her own cabin 1,000 times, but her hands were numb and clumsy. The kindling wouldn't catch, the paper smoldering and dying out. Frustration pricked at her eyes. It was such a simple task, yet here, in this wild place, she was failing her first test. Jacob entered, shaking snow from his coat, and saw her crouched by the hearth, a wisp of smoke her only reward. He didn't sigh, didn't mock her, didn't take the flint and steel from her hands. He simply came and knelt beside her on the hearthstone. "You're smothering it," he said, his voice low and even. "Fire needs to breathe. Same as us." He showed her how to build a small log cabin structure with the kindling, leaving a space in the center. He demonstrated how to strike the flint so the sparks fell directly onto the tinder. When she tried again, following his movements, a tiny flame flickered, caught and grew. As she fed the small fire, her hands moving closer to the growing warmth, he noticed them. They were not the soft, unblemished hands of a lady like Abigail Hart, nor were they the rough, broad hands of a farm wife. They were a map of her life. He saw the fine, crisscrossing calluses on her fingertips from years of needlework, mending miners' torn clothes for pennies, and he saw, near her knuckles, the faint, silvery scars of old blisters, the kind a person gets from hauling a heavy coal scuttle day after day. The people of Silver Hollow had looked at Sarah McKenna and seen a walking omen of death, a drain on their meager resources. They had given the mountain man the woman no one wanted, but in the quiet firelight, Jacob Stone looked at her hands and saw what they couldn't. He saw a woman who worked. He saw strength, resilience, and a quiet, stubborn refusal to be broken. The fire roared to life, pushing the shadows into the corners of the cabin. Outside, the wind shrieked, throwing handfuls of snow against the single glass-paned window. Jacob prepared a simple meal of fried salt pork and beans, and they ate in a comfortable silence, the storm providing a wild soundtrack to their first night. He spoke only once about his past, gesturing with his fork toward the howling wind. "Reminds me of the winter of '64, near the Cumberland. We were scouts. A dozen of us got pinned down by a blizzard just like this. Ran out of rations in 3 days." He fell silent, his eyes focused on something far away. Only 2 of us walked out when it broke. He didn't say more, but Sarah understood. He was telling her he knew how to survive. He was telling her she was safe. The next morning, the world was a sea of white. The storm had passed, leaving behind a deep, pristine blanket of snow that muffled all sound. The silence was absolute. When Sarah awoke from the simple cot he'd set up for her, Jacob was already outside, the rhythmic asterisk, thwack asterisk of his axe echoing in the clean, cold air. She pulled on her boots, wrapped Abigail's scarf around her neck, and went out. He was splitting firewood with an efficiency that was mesmerizing, each swing of his heavy axe landing with perfect precision. He had a pile of split logs that was already taller than she was. "Good morning," she said, her breath pluming. He paused, resting the axe. "Morning. Coffee's on the stove." "Thank you." She hesitated. "I would like to help. I am not accustomed to being idle. I can haul water, or learn to split the smaller logs. Whatever needs doing." He looked at her, then at the massive wood pile, then back at her. He saw the earnest set of her jaw. She was not asking for a favor. She was claiming her place. "All right," he said, with a slow nod. "We'll start with the water. The well bucket can be heavy when it's iced over." He then added, as if stating the most obvious rule in the world, "Around here, each person contributes. Each person is respected." It was a simple creed, but for Sarah, it felt like a constitution for a new life. Respect was not something to be earned or begged for. It was a given, as fundamental as the work itself. Later that afternoon, while Jacob was in the barn checking on his horse and the sled dogs, Sarah finally allowed herself a moment of privacy. She sat at the small wooden table and took out Liam's tin box. The contents felt different here, away from the prying eyes of the town. She laid out the journal and the folded letter from Millie's father. She read the letter first. It was short, the pencil barely legible. Asterisk. Calder's Dam. It's up Cold Creek, hidden in the canyon. It's stealing the flow. The main shaft ain't getting the seepage it needs. The dust, it's getting bad. Liam says the survey maps are wrong. We're going to look. Asterisk. The letter ended there, her hands trembling slightly. She opened Liam's journal to the hand-drawn map of the lower levels. It was a miner's map, full of notation she didn't understand. But then her eyes caught on something else. In the margins, Liam had drawn small, precise symbols, a triangle with a dot in the center, a circle with a cross, a series of parallel lines with the numbers beside them. A memory surfaced, sharp and clear. For 2 years, before she'd met Liam, she had attended a ladies' academy in Denver. It was a place for learning deportment and watercolor painting, but it had an eccentric head mistress who believed women should also understand practical matters. For 1 semester, they had studied cartography and basic land surveying. The symbols on Liam's map were not miners' scrawls. They were rudimentary geodesic markers, triangulation points, elevation lines, benchmarks. The men of Silver Hollow, including her own husband, had seen her as a woman who could sew a straight seam and bake a decent loaf of bread. They had never thought to ask what else she might know. They had looked, but they hadn't seen. Her heart began to beat faster. She walked to the cabin's window, which looked out over the small valley. A creek, now mostly frozen, snaked its way past the cabin. Jacob had broken the ice near the bank to fetch their water. She looked from the creek back to the map in her hands. The map showed the creek's path as Liam had known it when he first started working the claim. But the creek outside the window, the one flowing now, followed a different course. It was weaker, shallower, and it bent a full 50 yards south of where it was supposed to be. Asterisk. The water ain't right. It's stealing the flow. The words from the letter and the lines on the map collided in her mind with the force of a physical blow. The secret wasn't just a matter of stolen profits or fudged numbers. It was about water. In the arid West, water was more valuable than gold. It was life, and Royce Calder was diverting it for his own purposes, hiding it behind a secret dam. And in doing so, he had made the main mine dangerously dry and volatile. Liam hadn't died because of a curse. He had died because he had discovered a crime. The warmth of the cabin suddenly felt fragile. The howling of the storm had been a raw, honest danger. This was something else entirely, a cold, calculated evil that had followed her up the mountain, locked away in a simple tin box. She was no longer just a widow running from her past. She was the keeper of a truth that had already killed 6 men, and would surely kill again. The cold of the high country, once a crisp and cleansing thing, grew teeth as November deepened. Winter ceased to be a season and became a siege. The snow, which had fallen in soft, forgiving blankets, now came in hard, wind-driven pellets that scoured the landscape. Days were short, the sun a pale, distant coin in a steel-gray sky. Inside the cabin, a quiet rhythm had established itself. Jacob tended his trap lines, hunted, and maintained their fortress against the wilderness. Sarah managed the life within the walls, cooking, mending, and, in the long, firelit evenings, poring over Liam's journal until the numbers and lines swam before her eyes. The knowledge of what the journal contained had changed her. The grief for Liam was now mingled with a cold, hard anger. She had shared her discovery with Jacob, laying the map and the letter from Millie's father on the rough-hewn table. He had listened in silence, his expression unreadable. He didn't question her, didn't doubt her. He took the map, his large, calloused finger tracing the lines Liam had drawn, then went to the window and stared out at the altered course of the creek for a long time. "A man who's thirsty will do a lot for a drink," he'd said, his voice a low rumble. "A man who's greedy will do a lot more for a profit." He had seen the truth of it in her surveyor's marks and his own knowledge of the land. Cold Creek Canyon. It's a 2-day trek from here. North. Follows the ridge. A hard place. Good for hiding things. They knew they had to see it for themselves. Waiting for the spring thaw was not an option. By then, Calder could wash away any evidence along with the melting snows. They set out on snowshoes a week later, under the cover of a sky thick with the promise of more snow. Jacob carried a rifle and a pack with 2 days' worth of rations. Sarah, refusing to be left behind, carried a smaller pack with the tin box wrapped carefully in a spare blanket. The roles had subtly shifted. It was her map, her knowledge of the symbols, that guided their path along the frozen spine of the mountain. He was the scout, reading the signs of the weather and the tracks of animals, ensuring their safe passage. But she was the navigator, leading them toward a truth only she could fully decipher. The journey was brutal. The air was thin and bit at their lungs. They moved through a silent, white world, the only sound the crunch of their snowshoes and their own ragged breathing. They spent a night huddled in a shallow cave. A small fire, their only comfort against a cold so profound it felt like a physical presence. On the afternoon of the second day, Jacob held up a hand, signaling a halt. "Listen." At first, Sarah heard nothing but the wind. Then, a faint, unnatural sound reached her, a steady, rhythmic splash and rumble, alien in the great silence. It was the sound of moving water and machinery. They crept to the edge of the canyon, peering through a screen of snow-laden pines. Below them, tucked into a narrow gorge, was the dam. It was a crude but effective structure of felled logs and packed earth, a dark scar across the white landscape. It diverted a significant portion of the creek into a long wooden sluice that ran along the canyon wall. At the end of the sluice, 3 of Calder's men, bundled against the cold, were using the steady flow of water to wash gravel and rock from a small, private mine opening a seam of ore that clearly belonged to Calder alone. The wastewater, thick with silt, was channeled down a separate gully, disappearing into a sinkhole. It was a self-contained, secret operation. They had found it, the water that should have been seeping into the main mine, keeping the coal dust damp and stable, was here, being used to make a greedy man even richer. "He's bleeding the mountain dry," Sarah whispered, her voice filled with a venom that surprised her. Jacob's hand rested on his rifle. His eyes were cold, and he killed the men who found out. They made their way back to the cabin in grim silence. The image of the shadow dam burned into their minds. That night, the fire seemed to offer less warmth. Sarah opened the journal again, a new, desperate urgency guiding her. She ran her fingers over the pages, searching for something more, a final piece of the puzzle. It was a list of names under the heading, "Good Men Gone." Liam had written down the names of every miner who had died in the smaller accidents over the past year, a fallen timber here, a runaway ore cart there, next to 3 of the names, men known for being honest and outspoken. He had made a tiny, almost invisible mark, a small circle with a line through it, the symbol for a detonator cap, and beside that, a time that did not match the official record of the accident. The blood drained from her face. "Jacob." He came to the table. She pointed a trembling finger at the marks. "This wasn't just negligence. He didn't just let the mine become unsafe." Her voice broke. The collapse. Liam knew it was coming. These men, they were silenced before they could talk. The final collapse was meant to bury the last of the witnesses. It was murder. All of it. The word hung in the air, heavy and irrevocable. They were no longer dealing with a thief. They were dealing with a killer who had the law in his pocket and a whole town under his thumb. The wilderness, it seemed, had its own tests for them. A few days later, a sudden thaw was followed by a hard freeze, sealing the landscape in a crust of ice. Jacob had gone to check a distant trap line, leaving Sarah to manage the chores at the cabin. She was in the barn, forking hay for the horse, when she heard a low, guttural snuffle from the far stall. She froze. It was not the sound of the horse. Slowly, she peered over the stall door. A young black bear, gaunt and desperate from the early, hard winter, was clawing at a sack of feed. It was a creature not of malice, but of pure, driving hunger. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her for a second. Jacob was hours away. The rifle was in the cabin. She was trapped. Then, Jacob's calm voice echoed in her memory from their first night asterisk. Fire needs to breathe. Same as us. She took a slow, steadying breath. In a small supply chest by the barn door, Jacob kept emergency signaling equipment. She backed away slowly, her eyes locked on the bear, which had now torn the sack open. She reached the chest, her fingers fumbling with the latch. Inside were several wax-wrapped flares. She grabbed one, a flint and a steel striker. With movements that felt both agonizingly slow and incredibly fast, she struck the flint. Sparks flew. The flare's fuse caught with a fizz and a hiss. The bear looked up, startled by the sound. Sarah didn't hesitate. She threw the flare into the center of the barn floor. It erupted with a blinding white light and a thick, acrid cloud of gray smoke. The bear, terrified by the sudden explosion of light and the choking smoke, gave a panicked roar, spun around, and crashed through the barn's weaker back wall, fleeing into the woods. Sarah stood, heart hammering against her ribs. Amidst the lingering smoke, she hadn't screamed, she hadn't run, she had faced the danger and driven it back. A small, fierce smile touched her lips. She was no longer the town's fragile, unlucky widow. Her newfound strength was tested sooner than she expected. The next afternoon, 4 riders appeared on the ridge overlooking the valley. They were not lost hunters. The man in the lead, even at a distance, was unmistakable Deputy Jonah Cade. Jacob saw them first. Inside, he said to Sarah. His voice flat, he took his rifle from its pegs over the door. Stay away from the window. She did as he said, her stomach twisting into a cold knot. The confrontation they had feared was here. Cade and his men rode down into the valley and stopped 20 yards from the cabin, their horses steaming in the cold. Stone Cade bellowed, "Show yourself!" The cabin door opened and Jacob stepped out, the rifle held casually in the crook of his arm. He stood on the porch, a silent, immovable object. "That's far enough, Cade," he said, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "This is private land." Cade laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Ain't no private land up here, mountain man. It all belongs to the company, one way or another." He scanned the cabin, his eyes lingering on the chimney smoke. "Getting cozy up here. We heard you took in some charity from the town." "I took what I was owed on my trade," Jacob said. "My business is my own." "Is that a fact?" Cade leaned forward in his saddle, his smile turning into a sneer. "See, some folks are starting to think your business is Calder's business. Folks get to wondering why a man who likes his privacy so much suddenly takes in a stray. Wondering if maybe she's been filling your head with crazy stories. Stories about accidents. Stories that are bad for morale." "A man's got a right to talk in his own cabin," Jacob said. "He does," Cade agreed, patting his pistol. "But some stories are best kept to the fireside. They get out. They can cause a chill. Calder wouldn't want you catching a chill." "Stone, he's a concerned citizen." It was a threat, delivered with a thin veneer of civility. A warning to stay quiet, to stay out of Silver Hollow's affairs. "Tell Calder I appreciate his concern," Jacob said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "Now, you've said your piece. The trail back to town is that way." Cade held Jacob's gaze for a long moment, then spat a brown stream of tobacco juice onto the clean snow. "You're a long way from everything up here. Stone. A man could get lost. An accident could happen. Just like in the mines. He wheeled his horse around. Enjoy the winter. They rode away, leaving deep, ugly tracks in the snow. That night, a new visitor arrived. It was old Tom Garrett, the mail carrier, on a pair of worn-out snowshoes. He claimed to be checking a trap line that had belonged to his brother, but his eyes were furtive and he kept looking over his shoulder. He accepted a cup of coffee and, when he was sure they were alone, he pulled a thick, oilskin-wrapped package from inside his coat. "Abigail Hart asked me to bring this," he whispered, pushing it across the table to Sarah. "She said you'd know what to do with it. She said to tell you she wants to make things right." Tom left as quietly as he had come. Sarah unwrapped the package. Inside were several pages carefully torn from a bank ledger. It was a record of Royce Calder's private accounts, and on those pages, in neat columns, was the proof huge. Unexplained cash deposits made the day after every one of the fatal accidents Liam had noted in his journal. It was blood money, laundered through the Silver Hollow Bank. They now had the whole story. Liam's notes were the accusation. The secret dam was the method, and Abigail's ledger was the motive. The truth no longer felt like water, trickling through the cracks. It felt like a flood, gathering force behind a dam of their own, ready to be unleashed. The thaw came in the heart of winter, a strange, unseasonable warmth that was more unsettling than the deepest cold. The snow grew soft and heavy. The mountains wept, and the frozen creeks began to stir with a dangerous energy. For Jacob and Sarah, it was a sign. The mountain passes, though treacherous with slush and the risk of avalanches, were temporarily open. It was time to take the truth back to Silver Hollow. They descended from Beartooth Basin on the dog sled, a journey that was the reverse of their first. This time, they were not fleeing from judgment, but carrying it with them, wrapped in oilskin Liam's journal, the ledger pages, and the damning knowledge of the dam in Cold Creek Canyon. Silver Hollow looked different under the gray, dripping sky. The frozen ruts had turned to a thick, clinging mud that sucked at the sled's runners. The faces that turned to watch them arrive were no longer filled with the simple scorn Sarah remembered. Now, there was suspicion, fear, and a guarded curiosity. The story of the mountain man and the cast-off widow had become a piece of unsettling local lore over the winter months, and their return was an omen. Sarah did not avert her gaze. She met the stares of her former neighbors head-on. Her chin held high. The months in the wilderness had stripped away her fear, replacing it with a hard, quiet resolve. She was no longer a ghost in this town. She was a reckoning. Their first stop was the sheriff's office. A man with a drooping mustache sat behind the desk, a deputy's star pinned carelessly to his coat. It wasn't Sheriff Thompson. "Looking for the sheriff," Jacob said, his voice filling the small, dusty room. The deputy eyed them lazily. "Sheriff's away. County business. Won't be back for a week. Maybe 2, he smirked. "I'm holding things down." Jonah Cade appeared in the doorway of the back room, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. He was the one in charge. Well, he drawled, his eyes locking on Sarah. "Look what the thaw dragged in. Get tired of playing house in the mountains." "We're here to report a crime." "Cade," Sarah said, her voice steady and clear. "The murder of 6 miners." Cade's smirk widened, but his eyes went cold. "You're talking about the collapse. That was a tragedy. Mrs. McKenna. An act of God." "It was an act of Royce Calder," she countered. "And we have the proof." Cade laughed. A short, ugly bark. "Proof you got nothing. Just the mad ramblings of a bitter woman. Now, I suggest you and your wild man get back on that sled and disappear up the mountain again. Silver Hollow has forgotten you. It's best you keep it that way." The law was a closed door, bolted from the inside. Their next stop was the bank. Sarah went in alone, leaving Jacob to watch the street. The air inside was warm, smelling of paper and polished wood. Abigail Hart stood behind the counter, her face pale and drawn. When she saw Sarah, a flicker of fear crossed her features. Sarah walked directly to her. She didn't raise her voice. She simply placed one of the ledger pages on the polished counter between them. "Tom Garrett delivered your package," she said quietly. "Thank you." Abigail's composure crumbled. "I couldn't," she stammered, her eyes darting around the empty bank. "I couldn't live with it anymore. Royce, he owns this town. He owns my husband. I was a part of it, turning a blind eye. I am so sorry, Sarah." "Sorrow won't bring them back," Sarah said, her voice firm but not unkind. "But this might bring justice. Cade has the sheriff's office locked down. We need to get a message to the U.S. Marshal in Denver." Abigail's eyes lit with a sudden, desperate purpose. "The telegraph." "Calder pays the station chief, but not the night operator. Elias Thorne. He's a good man. His younger brother was. He was in the collapse. Elias owes Calder nothing but grief. He's your man. The office is at the end of the street, by the train depot." This was Abigail's true act of penance, not just handing over evidence, but providing the key to using it. At the telegraph office, Elias Thorne was a thin, nervous man with ink-stained fingers and haunted eyes. He listened to them, his hands twisting a loose thread on his shirt. When Sarah mentioned his brother's name, his face hardened. He read the short, urgent message she had written, a summary of their evidence against Calder. "Sending this, Calder will know," he whispered. "We know," Jacob said, "but it's the only way." Elias nodded, his decision made. He sat at his desk, and the small office was soon filled with the sharp, staccato clicking of the telegraph key, a sound like a tiny hammer chipping away at the foundation of Calder's empire. As they stepped back out into the muddy street, Sarah felt a profound sense of release. The secret was out. The clock was ticking, but she also felt the weight of a dozen unseen eyes. Cade's men were everywhere, leaning in doorways, watching from alleyways. Jacob's hand rested on her arm. "Stay close," he murmured. "Something's not right." He was guiding her toward the livery stable when 3 men stepped out of a narrow alley, blocking their path. Jacob shoved Sarah behind him just as 2 more appeared at their backs. They were trapped. "Cade sends his regards," one of them snarled. The fight was sudden and brutal. Jacob didn't wait for them to make the first move. He moved with a speed and economy that was terrifying. Not like a brawler, but like a hunter. He used fists, elbows, and feet, disabling the first 2 men before they could even draw their weapons. But he was outnumbered. One of the thugs caught him across the back with a heavy wooden club. Jacob grunted in pain but spun, wrenching the club away and using it to sweep another man off his feet. He was a whirlwind of controlled violence, but the odds were too great. The last man pulled a knife, slashing wildly. Jacob deflected the blade with the club, but the tip caught him high on his left arm, ripping through his buckskin jacket. Roaring with pain and fury, Jacob brought the club down on the man's wrist with a sickening crack. The knife clattered to the mud. The remaining men, seeing their leader disarmed, lost their nerve and fled. Jacob stood panting in the middle of the street, his arm bleeding freely, surrounded by the groaning forms of his attackers. Before the town could even process the shock of the street fight, a new cry went up, thin and terrified at first, then swelling into a roar. Fire! A column of thick black smoke was billowing into the gray sky from the far end of town, the lumber yard, and right next to it, the offices of the Silver Hollow Mining Company. Chaos erupted. Men shouted, women screamed, and people ran in every direction. But it was a panic without purpose. Jacob, clutching his bleeding arm, looked at Sarah. "It's a diversion," he grunted. "He knows about the telegraph. He's burning the evidence." In that moment of pandemonium, something shifted in Sarah. The town that had cast her out was now falling apart. She saw Millie standing frozen in front of the blacksmith shop, her face white with terror. Sarah ran to her, grabbing the girl's small hand. "It's all right, Millie," she said, her voice cutting through the noise with an authority she didn't know she possessed. "We need to help." She turned to the group of women huddled near the general store. "The well form a line. We need a bucket brigade." The women stared at her, dumbfounded. For months, she had been the object of their scorn. Now, she was giving them orders, but her certainty was a rock in the swirling tide of fear. One by one, they moved, grabbing buckets, pails, anything that would hold water, and formed a human chain stretching from the town well toward the fire. Sarah put Millie to work alongside them, keeping the girl busy and safe. The fire raged, consuming the dry timber with a terrifying hunger. Jacob, ignoring his wound, joined a group of men trying to pull down a section of fence to create a firebreak. Royce Calder and Jonah Cade were there, but they were a study in misdirection. "Save the stables," Calder bellowed. Pointing away from the blaze, "The horses are our priority." "Anyone who gets near that office gets a bullet," Cade shouted at a group of miners. "Shoving them back. The whole thing's about to go stay back." They were actively preventing anyone from saving the one building that truly mattered. Calder, his face illuminated by the hellish orange glow of the flames, had shed his mask of the town patriarch. He was a cornered animal, willing to let the entire town burn to cover his tracks. Amid the smoke and shouting, a frantic figure pushed his way through the crowd toward Sarah. It was Elias Thorne, the telegraph operator, his face smudged with soot, a piece of paper clutched in his hand. "Mrs. McKenna!" he yelled over the roar of the fire. A reply from the marshal in Denver. She took the paper with a trembling, water-slicked hand. The first part of the message made her heart leap. Marshal Westlake and deputies en route. ETA 24 hours. Secure all evidence and detain suspects if possible. U.S. Law is coming to Silver Hollow. But there was more. It was a second, general broadcast, sent out to all stations in the territory. Urgent weather advisory. Unseasonable thaw causing rapid melt. All earthen dam structures compromised. Imminent flood risk. Evacuate low-lying valleys immediately. Repeat, imminent flood risk. Sarah stared at the words, the heat of the fire on her face suddenly feeling like an icy chill. The marshal was coming. Justice was coming. But it would be too late. The thaw that had allowed them to descend the mountain was also the instrument of their destruction. Calder's dam, the secret source of his wealth and the cause of so many deaths, was now a ticking time bomb, filled to bursting with a winter's worth of melted snow and ice. The fire was a lie, a spectacle to distract them. The real danger, the real monster, was a wall of water waiting to obliterate everything in its path. Calder wasn't just burning his records. He was about to wash the entire town, and everyone in it, off the face of the earth. The roar of the fire was a hungry beast, but the words on the telegraph slip were the voice of God. Imminent flood risk. Sarah stood frozen for a heartbeat, the heat of the burning lumberyard on one side, the icy certainty of the dam on the other. Silver Hollow was caught between two destructions, one of smoke and one of water. Jacob came to her side, tearing a strip from his shirt to create a makeshift bandage for his bleeding arm. His face was grim in the firelight. "Calder's endgame," he said, his voice a low growl. "He's not just burning the evidence. He's burying the town that created it." Panic was a contagion, spreading faster than the flames. People were running, shouting, saving meaningless possessions while their lives were about to be washed away. Sarah grabbed Jacob's good arm. "We can't stop the fire," she said, her voice sharp and clear, cutting through the chaos. "But the dam, Liam's journal, he wrote about the spillway pins, how they were designed for emergency release. That dam is in Cold Creek Canyon. It's a hard climb in daylight. At night, in this sleet." He started, but he saw the look in her eyes and didn't finish. There was no other choice. "We need help," she said. They found Tom Garrett near the well, his old face a mask of despair. "The whole town's going to hell," he coughed, wiping soot from his eyes. "Not if we get to the dam first." "Tom," Sarah said, showing him the telegraph message. "We need every able-bodied man who isn't on Calder's payroll." A small, desperate group began to form in the shadows behind the livery stable, away from the blinding light of the fire. Tom Garrett brought 2 miners, rough men named Silas and O'Connell, whose brothers had died in the collapse. Their grief had finally hardened into a desire for vengeance. And then Abigail Hart appeared, her fine dress smudged with ash, a heavy leather satchel clutched in her hands. "I'm coming with you," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "During the confusion, I went to his office, the real one." She patted the satchel. "I took his primary ledger. He won't be able to hide a single dollar now." It was the final, irrevocable step in her redemption. There were 5 of them against an unknown number of Cade's men, against a failing dam, against the night itself. Jacob, wincing as he checked the action on his rifle, looked at Sarah. He saw no fear in her, only a terrible, focused clarity. She was no longer just fighting for Liam's memory. She was fighting for the soul of the town that had wronged her. The climb was a nightmare of ice and mud. A freezing rain had begun to fall, turning the rocky trail into a treacherous slide. They moved in darkness, guided by a single lantern. The fire in Silver Hollow, a distant, angry red eye below them. The roar of the engorged creek grew louder with every step, a constant, threatening thunder that vibrated through the soles of their boots. They reached the mouth of Cold Creek Canyon and saw the dam. It was a monster in the gloom, a dark, hulking wall of logs and earth, visibly bowing under the immense pressure of the water behind it. Torches flickered on top of the structure. Jonah Cade and 4 of his men were there, rifles ready, patrolling the walkway. Royce Calder stood among them, a dark silhouette against the churning, white-capped water of the reservoir, overseeing the final moments of his scorched earth plan. "They're not waiting for it to break," Jacob whispered, pulling his small party behind a cluster of frozen boulders. "They're guarding it, making sure it holds until the last possible second to build the pressure. They want to scour this valley clean." "Then we don't have time for a siege," Sarah said. She pulled Liam's journal from the waterproof oilskin pouch she wore. "The main release pin. It's on the far side of the spillway. It will take a chisel and a hammer, maybe a small powder charge to break it loose." "They'll see you before you're halfway across." Silas, the miner, grunted. "You'll have to make sure they're looking the other way," Jacob said. He looked at the 2 miners and Tom. "We draw their fire. Give Sarah the time she needs. Aim for the torches first. Plunge them into darkness." He turned to Sarah, his face etched with concern. "This is a fool's errand, Sarah." "It's the only one we've got," she replied, meeting his gaze. She pulled a small, wax-sealed packet of blasting powder and a heavy-duty chisel from Jacob's pack. "Just buy me 5 minutes." The first shot was a deafening crack that echoed off the canyon walls. Jacob, firing one-handed from a braced position, extinguished the torch nearest to Calder. The miners opened up immediately after, their shots splintering the log barricade on the dam. Muzzle flashes stabbed the darkness from both sides. It was chaos, a deadly dance of light and shadow in the driving, icy rain. Jacob felt a searing pain as a bullet grazed his already wounded shoulder. Spinning him around, he gritted his teeth, leaned against the rock, and kept firing. Tom Garrett, surprisingly steady, reloaded with the calm precision of an old soldier. Under the cover of the firefight, Sarah slipped from behind the rocks and scrambled down the muddy embankment to the base of the dam. The walkway on top was a death trap, but a narrow maintenance beam, slick with ice and spray, ran across the face of the structure just above the churning spillway. It was her only path. Hand over hand, her fingers numb with cold, she began to pull herself across. The wood was treacherous, the roar of the water below deafening. She was a ghost in the storm, a small, determined figure moving through a hail of unseen bullets. She could feel the dam vibrating, groaning like a dying beast. It wouldn't hold much longer. She reached the central buttress, where the release mechanism was housed. It was a massive iron pin set into a reinforced collar. She wedged the tip of her chisel into the joint, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. A lull in the firing. A voice, raw with fury, carried over the din. "It's the woman! Stop her!" It was Calder. He had seen her. He stood on the walkway directly above, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. Sarah ignored him, raising the heavy hammer she had tucked into her belt. The first blow rang out, a sharp metallic clang. The second, the third. The pin was frozen solid. It wasn't moving. "You think you can undo this?" Calder screamed down at her, his voice cracking with madness. "This valley is a tomb I'm just tidying up." "You killed them!" Sarah screamed back, her voice raw with grief and fury as she hammered at the pin. "You killed Liam! You killed all those men for what? For a little more rock in your sluice!" A figure was scrambling along the walkway above. Jonah Cade. He launched himself over the side, landing heavily on the beam a few feet away from her. His face was a feral snarl. "It's over, widow," he spat, lunging for her. He grabbed the collar of her coat, pulling her backward. The hammer fell from her numb fingers, clattering into the darkness. She was slipping, her boots finding no purchase on the icy beam. She was going to fall. A roar of pure rage came from the far side of the dam. Jacob, ignoring his wounds, had charged from their cover. He ran onto the walkway, a living avalanche of fury. He didn't have a weapon, but he didn't need one. He threw himself at Cade, a desperate, flying tackle that sent both men crashing off the walkway. They fell together, a tangle of limbs, hitting the churning, shallow water of the spillway with a violent splash. The current was a liquid battering ram, immediately seizing them. At that exact moment, Sarah, freed from Cade's grasp, wedged the packet of blasting powder into the crack she'd made and struck her flint and steel. A spark, a fizzing fuse. She scrambled back just as the charge went off with a dull, concussive boom. The iron pin shattered, with a groan that seemed to shake the very mountains. The spillway gate broke free, a controlled but immense torrent of water erupted from the base of the dam, a thundering gray tongue that roared down the canyon. Sarah clung to the beam, watching in horror as the wave swept down the spillway. Cade was gone, vanished instantly into the maelstrom. She saw Jacob's head surface for a moment, his arm flailing, before he was swept away into the churning chaos. "The rope!" a voice shouted. Tom Garrett was on the bank, a coil of rope in his hands. He threw it with all his strength. It landed in the water just a few feet from where Jacob had disappeared. Sarah held her breath. A hand broke the surface, grasped the rope, and held on. The flood raged for what felt like an eternity. With the help of Silas and O'Connell, they hauled Jacob from the current, battered and half drowned, but alive. On the dam above, Royce Calder stood alone, his men having fled, his enforcer gone, his plan in ruins. He was just a man, stripped of his power, watching the lifeblood of his secret operation drain away into the valley it was meant to destroy. As a gray, weeping dawn broke over the canyon, the roar subsided to a steady, manageable flow. The great reservoir behind the dam had shrunk, the immense pressure gone. They were all soaked, freezing, and utterly exhausted. Jacob's shoulder was a mess, but the wound was clean. Abigail clutched her precious ledger. Tom and the miners stared at the now tamed dam, their faces grim but satisfied. Sarah looked down the canyon, toward Silver Hollow. The town was still there, battered, perhaps, and certainly flooded in the lower regions, but it was not erased. She had faced down the town's judgment, the wilderness, and the raw fury of both man and nature. She had walked through fire and flood. She was no longer the woman they had given away. She was the woman who had saved them. Justice arrived on horseback at noon. 5 riders, their coats long and their hats pulled low against the persistent drizzle. They rode with an easy, unhurried authority that was utterly alien to Silver Hollow. At their head was a tall, lean man with a gray-streaked mustache and eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by anything. The silver star pinned to his coat, a U.S. Marshal's badge, gleamed dully in the weak light. The town was a wreck. The lower end of the main street was a quagmire of mud and debris, the controlled flood having done its work, scouring away the ground but leaving the buildings intact. The lumber yard was a blackened, smoldering ruin, the air thick with the smell of wet, charred wood. People moved through the street like ghosts, their faces numb with shock, trying to comprehend the twin disasters of the night. The marshal's posse reined in their horses in front of the burned-out shell of the mining office. Royce Calder was there, directing a handful of his remaining loyal men in a pointless salvage effort. He turned as the riders approached, his face a mask of civic concern. "Marshal, thank God you're here," he boomed. Striding forward, "We've had a terrible night. Arsonists, looters. My town is in chaos." Marshal Westlake swung down from his horse, his movements deliberate. He didn't offer a handshake. "I'm not here about the fire." "Calder," he said, his voice flat and hard. "I'm here about the water. And the men you buried." He pulled a folded warrant from his coat pocket. "Royce Calder, I have a warrant for your arrest on the federal charges of fraud, conspiracy, and the murders of Liam McKenna, Thomas Finch, Daniel O'Connell." The marshal continued to read the names of the 6 men from the final collapse, his voice cutting through the stunned silence of the gathered townspeople. Calder's face went from disbelief to a blotchy, purple rage. "This is preposterous slander. On what grounds do you base these insane accusations?" he sputtered. From the crowd, Abigail Hart stepped forward. She was no longer the impeccable banker's wife, but a woman stripped down to her essential courage. She handed the heavy leather satchel to the marshal, on the grounds of his own bookkeeping. "Marshal." Westlake opened the ledger. He turned a few pages, his eyes scanning the columns of numbers. Then, in a clear, carrying voice, he began to read aloud. June 12th, 1875. Accident. Shaft 4. Thomas Finch, deceased. Deposit, R. Calder, personal account, $12,000. August 3rd, 1875. Accident. Orcart, Patrick Slattery. Deceased. Deposit, R. Calder, personal account, $15,000. He continued, matching the date of each man's death with a massive, inexplicable deposit of cash. It was a litany of greed, a balance sheet of human lives traded for silver. With every entry, the foundation of Silver Hollow cracked a little more. The man who had built their town, who had employed them, who had preached the gospel of hard work and prosperity, was a common killer. Calder lunged, not at the marshal, but at Abigail. "You treacherous!" He never finished the sentence. One of the deputies stepped in, his movements swift and professional, and slammed Calder against the muddy wall of a building. Iron cuffs snapped shut around his wrists. The great man of Silver Hollow was finished. From the edge of the crowd, Reverend Pike watched, his face ashen. He had stood in his pulpit and preached Calder's gospel, had spoken of bad luck and divine punishment, had helped cast Sarah out. His silence now was a confession, a damning admission of his own moral bankruptcy. He turned and shuffled back toward his empty church, a man hollowed out by his own hypocrisy. The town's makeshift infirmary had been set up in the church hall, the pews pushed back to make room for cots. Jacob lay on one, his shoulder expertly bandaged by a surprisingly diligent doctor. Whitlow, the doctor, seeing which way the wind was now blowing, had rediscovered his Hippocratic oath. Jacob was quiet, his eyes following Sarah as she moved through the room, tending to the injured, her presence a source of calm in the disarray. He watched the way people looked at her now, not with scorn, but with a kind of awe. They came to her with questions, with problems, with their grief. She was becoming the center of their shattered world, and a cold knot of fear tightened in his gut. He was a man of the mountains, of silence and solitude. This world of committees and councils was not his, and he feared it was becoming hers. Sarah found Abigail sitting alone on a pew, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She sat beside her, the silence stretching between them. "They'll want me to testify," Abigail said to the floorboards. "My husband, he'll be ruined." "He was part of it." "Abigail," Sarah said, her voice gentle but firm. "I know." Abigail finally looked up, her eyes filled with a terrible clarity. "I know. I won't ask for your forgiveness. Sarah, I don't deserve it, but I hope one day you'll understand that I did what I could to set it right in the end." Sarah thought of the warm scarf, the ledger, the courage it had taken to walk across that street and hand the marshal the proof. "Justice isn't about forgiveness," she said softly. "It's about making things right. You helped do that. That's what matters now." She placed her hand over Abigail's. It was not an absolution, but an acknowledgement, a bridge built over a chasm of betrayal. Later, Sarah found Millie sweeping mud from the blacksmith's porch, a small, solitary figure trying to impose order on the chaos. Sarah knelt beside her. "Your father was a brave man. Millie, he and Liam, they were trying to tell the truth." The girl's eyes filled with tears. "There's no one left for me now." "That's not true," Sarah said, pulling the girl into a hug. "You'll stay with me. We'll figure things out together. I could use a good student." Millie clung to her, the first flicker of hope in her young life. Sarah was no longer just surviving, she was building. That afternoon, the town gathered in the muddy square for a memorial. It wasn't Reverend Pike who led it, but old Tom Garrett. He stood on the steps of the general store, holding Liam's journal. "These men were not victims of bad luck," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "They were good men, husbands, fathers, and sons. They were stolen from us, and it's time we said their names and remembered them as they were." He began to read the names from the journal. As he read each one, the church bell tolled, a single, solemn peal that echoed off the mountains. For the first time, the bell wasn't ringing for the glory of a rich man or the start of a work shift. It was ringing for the poor, the forgotten, the dead. It was the sound of the town reclaiming its soul. After the ceremony, a small delegation of miners approached Sarah. Their spokesman, a grim-faced man named Henderson, twisted his hat in his hands. "Mrs. McKenna, we were wrong. We treated you poorly. We were scared, and Calder fed that fear." He looked up, his eyes pleading. "The mine is all we know. Without it, this town dies. We need a leader. We trust you." Jacob, standing on the porch of the infirmary, saw it all. He saw the way they looked to her, the way she stood a little taller, her expression serious and thoughtful. They weren't just offering an apology. They were offering her a crown. Sarah looked at their hopeful, desperate faces. "If I am to help," she said, her voice carrying the weight of her new authority, "then things will change. A portion of the mine's assets, seized from Calder, will go into a fund for the widows, for the children, to start a school. We will care for our own, not cast them out." It was not a request, it was a condition, and they nodded in silent, solemn agreement. That evening, as the light began to fade, Marshal Westlake found Sarah sitting on the steps of the temporary clinic, watching the quiet activity of the town. "You're a remarkable woman, Mrs. McKenna," he said, taking a seat beside her. "I'm just a widow who wanted the truth," she replied. "You found more than that." He looked out at the mountains, a thoughtful expression on his face. "I wanted you to know. Your husband's journal did more than just hang Royce Calder. We've suspected a ring of this kind of corruption for years, stretching all the way to the territorial government. Men like Calder buying up claims, sabotaging their rivals, silencing anyone who gets in their way. We had pieces, whispers, but nothing solid. He turned to her, his eyes filled with a deep respect. That little tin box of yours, it was the key. It connected the names, the money, the methods. Because of what you and your husband did, we're going to be able to save a half-dozen other towns from the same fate. Your Liam, he's a hero, far beyond the borders of Silver Hollow. Sarah felt a wave of emotion so profound it almost buckled her. The years of quiet suffering, the months of terror and survival, the terrible risks, they all settled into a new shape. It wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a battle, a small, vital battle in a much larger war. The strength of one woman, a woman the world had deemed worthless, had tipped the scales. She looked up at the darkening peaks of the San Juan Mountains, the place that had been her sanctuary, and then back at the flickering lights of the town that now looked to her as its future. She had a choice to make. Spring came to the San Juan Mountains not as a gentle guest, but as a conquering army. It waged a slow, relentless war against the snow, driving it back into the highest peaks. The creeks, freed from their icy prisons, ran loud and full, washing the land clean. On the south-facing slopes, the first green shoots of wild onion and columbine pushed through the damp earth, and the air, for the first time in months, smelled of life instead of ice. Down in Silver Hollow, the town was undergoing its own painful, muddy rebirth. With Royce Calder and his key cronies gone in federal custody, a power vacuum had been left, but it was not filled with chaos. Instead, something fragile and new was taking root. Under the guidance of a town council now led by Henderson, the storekeeper, and a humbled doctor, Whitlow, the people were clearing the flood damage, rebuilding the flume, and talking about how to reopen the mine not as a private kingdom, but as a community trust. Sarah was the heart of this new Silver Hollow. Her days were a blur of meetings and decisions. She oversaw the distribution of supplies from the company store, organized work crews, and, with Abigail Hart's meticulous help, began the complex legal work of establishing the Widows and Children's Fund with the assets seized from Calder. She and Millie had moved into the small house behind the doctor's office, and in the evenings, Sarah would teach the girl her letters by the light of a kerosene lamp. She was respected. She was needed. She was the woman the town now wanted, desperately. And it was slowly breaking her heart. Jacob stayed for 2 weeks, his presence a quiet, solid anchor in the swirling currents of the town's reconstruction. His wound healed cleanly, and he spent his days helping the miners shore up the town's water system. His mountain-honed skills with wood and stone proving invaluable. But he was a caged thing. He moved with a restless energy, his eyes always drifting north, toward the high peaks. He watched Sarah, saw the mantle of leadership settle on her shoulders, and a quiet sadness grew in his eyes. The world had taken notice of what he had seen in her, and he feared the world would not give her back. One evening, as a warm Chinook wind blew down the valley, he found her sitting on the church steps, staring up at the stars that were just beginning to prick the twilight sky. "They're planning to name the new school after you," he said, his voice a low rumble. He didn't sit, but stood a few feet away, as if a chasm had opened between them. Sarah sighed, the sound weary. "That's foolishness. It should be named for the men who died. They see you as a founder, Sarah, of this new town." She finally looked at him, and in the fading light, he saw the deep exhaustion in her eyes. "This isn't my town, Jacob. It's a place I survived. The woman they need. She isn't me. She's a symbol, a story they tell themselves to feel better about what they did." She stood up and closed the small distance between them. "My home isn't here." The knot of fear in his chest loosened, replaced by a surge of hope so powerful it almost staggered him. She made her announcement to the town council the next day. She would not stay. She was going back to Beartooth Basin, but she was not abandoning them. She officially nominated Abigail Hart to manage the Widows' Fund, citing her head for numbers and her deep personal need to make amends. She laid out a clear plan for the school's charter. She gave them the tools to rebuild, but she would not be their monument. Her life was her own. There were protests, of course, but there was also a deep, dawning understanding. They had tried to own her once, first with their scorn and now with their praise. Both were cages. Her choosing to leave was the final, most important lesson she could teach them about freedom. They were married a week later, on the porch of the cabin in Beartooth Basin, as the aspen trees were unfurling their first trembling green leaves. It was a perfect spring day. Tom Garrett, who had made the 2-day ride up from town, served as the witness, his old eyes twinkling. Millie was there, too, her face scrubbed clean, acting as Sarah's maid of honor. She held a bouquet of wild columbine she had picked that morning. There was no preacher, no organ music. Tom, who also served as the part-time justice of the peace, read a few simple words from a worn leather book. Jacob, dressed in a clean buckskin shirt, placed a simple ring, hammered from a small nugget of silver he'd found in the creek, onto Sarah's finger. She, in turn, gave him no ring but a promise, her eyes locked on his, and with the mountains as their cathedral and the wind in the pines as their choir, they were married. That night, after a celebratory meal of roasted grouse and wild onions, after Tom and Millie had settled into their bedrolls by the hearth, Sarah and Jacob sat outside, leaning against the solid log wall of the cabin. The sky was a vast, velvet blanket strewn with a glittering dust of stars. A deep, peaceful quiet had settled over the valley. He took her hand, his thumb tracing the outline of the new ring. He was quiet for a long time. Then he spoke, his voice soft with a kind of wonder, as if he were still trying to understand the miracle of it all. "They gave me the woman no one wanted," he said, his gaze on the distant, snow-capped peaks. "But I saw what they couldn't." Sarah smiled, a slow, gentle curve of her lips. She leaned her head against his shoulder, the rough wool of his shirt familiar and comforting. "No one had the right to give me." "Jacob," she replied, her voice filled with a quiet, unshakable certainty. "I made my own choice." The months that followed settled into a gentle, productive rhythm. The small patch of earth they had cleared behind the cabin became a thriving garden, its potato blossoms a cheerful white and purple against the dark soil. Once a month, Millie would ride up on a mule borrowed from the livery, bringing supplies and a bundle of letters. There were letters from Abigail, detailing the progress of the fund and the construction of the new schoolhouse. And there were letters from the other widows, simple, heartfelt notes of thanks, telling Sarah of sons who were now getting an education, of debts paid, of a future that held something other than grim poverty. One afternoon, as Sarah sat on the porch reading these letters, Jacob came and sat beside her. He said nothing, but placed a single, perfect pine cone in her open palm. Its scales were tightly closed, protecting the life within. It was a promise of resilience, of a life that could withstand the harshest winters and still grow tall. Sarah closed her hand around it, a secret smile playing on her lips, as her other hand went unconsciously to rest on her still flat stomach. A new seed, a new life, a new beginning. Marshall Westlake wrote to her as well. His letter was an invitation, a formal request for her to travel to Denver to act as a consultant for a new federal task force investigating labor abuses in the Western Territories. "Your insight would be invaluable. Mrs. McKenna," he wrote. "You have a voice that needs to be heard." It was a new door, a path that led to an important, influential life in the world below. A few years ago, she would have given anything for such an opportunity. She wrote her reply that same day, a short, simple note. "Thank you for your offer. Marshall." It read, "I will help in any way I can. I will write from the mountains." Their last project before the summer truly took hold was to build a new door for the cabin. The old one was solid, but it was plain and weathered. They chose a straight-grained pine, and together they began to carve it. He showed her how to use the chisel, how to follow the grain of the wood. They didn't carve elaborate pictures, but simple, deep lines, patterns that spoke of the mountains and the trees. He would make a cut, and then she would make one, their hands often touching. Each mark was a memory, each shaving a moment of shared peace. They were not just building a door, they were building a home, carving their story, one quiet, peaceful day at a time, into the very wood that would shelter them. Thank you so much for listening to this story. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, we invite you to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Night, and give this video a like. And to help this story reach more listeners, please consider hitting the hype button. Your support means the world to us.